how there is a mechanism for survival, for an afterlife, for our soul and our consciousness separating from the body.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to take a deep dive into the history of parapsychology and psychical research. My guest is Nancy Zingrone, who received her doctorate in psychology from the University of Edinburgh, with her dissertation examining the debates concerning the legitimacy of parapsychology. She is joining the faculty of the California Institute for Human Science, where she will be teaching the early history of parapsychology and psychical research, the topic that we'll cover here. She is now also a core distinguished part-time professor in the John F. Kennedy School of Psychology and Social Sciences, associated with National University. She has served as the executive editor of the International Journal of Parapsychology and has twice served as president of the Parapsychological Association. Nan is based in the Midwest, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Nan. It is a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see you too.
We're going to be talking about a subject dear to my heart and I think dear to your heart, the history of parapsychology and psychical research. And I have to say, it's been my experience talking to college students in particular, but many other people, they know that there is such a field as parapsychology, but very few people know that it has a history that goes back over 140 years.
Yeah, very far back.
It's really quite an illustrious history. People are amazed when I tell them that some of the leading scientists from the 19th century were actively engaged in this field. Let me ask you, Nan, you've been involved in the field for a long time. Given this long history, why do you think so few people know about it?
People are interested in certain aspects, I think, of parapsychology. They're either into remote viewing, or they're into apparitions, or they're interested in poltergeists or OBEs or whatever it might be. And those are the books that they're reading, so they're not really getting that overview kind of thing until they really get stuck with the field and start reading all the things like Parapsychology, a handbook for the 21st century, and those kinds of books. And then there's the media problem, which we've had for decades and decades and decades. From that guy, I can't remember, I think it was in the 50s and 60s, there was some guy that would get on and kind of say, oh, we're going to be going to Dr. Rhine's thing and we're going to be talking about it. And it was on television. And you would have these relatively quiet types of experiences blown up into something hyper spectacular, so that it was interesting to the viewers. And then now we've got Ghostbusters for, 20 years, 25 years on television. Many of them at each other's throats sometimes. So you get this idea that it isn't really scientific, that there really isn't a academic background, and they don't know that Fechner, who was a very important physiologist in the beginning of the 19th century, very, very, very traditional scientist, was absolutely fascinated by psychical research and these kinds of experiences that were all around. And they don't realize that was happening. They don't realize that William James, and putting aside some of his biographers who like to kind of take that completely out and pretend that he never had an interest, he really was so very solidly interested in it that he used to get letters from his sister Alice to tell him, "Why are you hanging around with those guys from London?" So there's all these, Charles Roche, there's so many people who were very much immersed in their area of science over the 19th century, their careers, but they were also thinking that there is something about psychical research and all those experiences that actually connect, and they're trying to figure that out. And then at some point, around the 1900s, the people who were, I think, emerging psychiatry and emerging psychology said, we're never going to get the imprimatur of being real sciences unless we get rid of these guys that are out there talking to people who see ghosts. So there was this bifurcation at the beginning of the 20th century, and that made things quite difficult, I think. And it's one of those things where you can say, when they always say Nixon is the only person that could have gone to China at that point. Well, Duke was the only American university that could do what they did when William McDougall came and said, yeah, let this guy Rhine do some of that stuff, And eventually Duke, in its early days, almost 40 years, had a unit for parapsychological experimentation. They kind of left some of the more fun stuff off. Like Hornell Hart in sociology, he was the guy who did the OBEs, not the people in the, because they were trying to be very, very, very scientific. And I started reading when I was 13 years old. I had a friend in high school who saw apparitions. And we were always going to the library to try to figure out what that was about. And there was a woman in the 50s. I come from Woodstock, Illinois, which is 11 miles south of the Wisconsin border. There was a librarian in the 50s and early 60s who was really interested in the Rhinean parapsychology experimental kind of thing. So she had everything. She had everything that Rhine wrote, everything that Louisa Rhine wrote, everything from Pratt, it was all that stuff. And I would go an ESP60, which even when I was in Edinburgh, when I brought that up to some of my colleagues who were just getting started in parapsychology, they were like, what? What is that about? So it was one of those books that was really written for serious students and serious researchers. And it came out in 1940. That was in my library. So as an early teenager, I was reading all of that stuff to try and figure out what was happening. And I've had probably one of every single experience you can have, but not more than one necessarily. And then I always had this thing where, oh my God, this is so okay, but it could have been, so.
You've covered a lot of ground here, Nan, and I need to go back because for one thing, you've used the term OBE a couple of times, and I'm not sure that all our viewers will understand what OBE stands for.
Well, it's out-of-body experience, and I think early on, like in the 70s, they were even calling them UBIs, out-of-body experiences, but now it's OBE. And it's interesting because people have these experiences where they wake up or suddenly have a shift in their consciousness, and they see themselves outside of themselves, but it's not just that. Then suddenly they're in that vision of themselves going up the road, going down the hill, whatever. My first husband was a lovely guy, and he was, when we were getting married, he was running around taking the patterns. This is so how cheap we were back then. So I was going to do everybody's, except one of them. I was sending them all these patterns for them to decide what they wanted to, what bridesmaid thing they wanted me to sew. So he gets on his motorcycle and off he goes, and he comes around a corner, and a guy in a car hits him while he's turning on that corner. And seconds later, he's sitting on top of the building on the next street, and he's watching this poor guy fly off of this great big, Norton motorcycle. Gosh, that looks like mine, that was going through his head. And it's, what's going on there? And then suddenly the guy sort of rotated in the air and hit the ground on his back and started sliding towards the curb. And he said, "Oh my God, this guy is going to get killed if he keeps going towards that curb." And then suddenly he was on the ground looking up, and his body was slowing down, and he stopped about 2 inches away from the curb. So this was his experience, and he had a broken leg, and I knew about that, and I never heard this thing. He never said this. 7 years later, I'm teaching an intro parapsychology course at the Field Museum in Chicago. And they had given me a really big room because we had about 300 people that signed up. And I was sitting on the edge of the stage, and I said, "This is what an OBE is." And I described it. And I said, how has anybody here had that? And my husband puts his arm up, and I said, "You see that guy? I'm married to that guy. I've never heard this story. Stand up and tell us your story." And so he did that. And he for years thought that it wasn't a real experience because the doctor that took him into the hospital, and then some of the nurses all said, "Listen, that's just you do a thing so that you don't have to feel the pain and blah, blah, blah. That's nothing really. It's just, your imagination." So he never mentioned it to me, even though he knew that I was studying with John Bisaha and Brenda Dunn at London College, and taking all these classes and teaching them at one of the other universities and so on. So that was a stitch. But it's people look at it different ways. They look at it as it can be imaginal. They can look at it as a kind of a transcendental experience, but they can also look at it as the possibility of how there is a mechanism for survival, for an afterlife, for our soul and our consciousness separating from the body. And for Carlos, that's what that was. That's what he felt. It was one of those highways into the complete rich discovery of evidence of survival. So and for me it was like sometimes that way and sometimes I could never go the whole hog, but I found it absolutely fascinating.
You mentioned Carlos, and I didn't mention before by way of introduction that your late husband, Carlos Alvarado, was, like yourself, a specialist in the history of parapsychology, and he's been a guest on New Thinking Aloud several times.
After he passed in 2021, I think I watched all 4 of your interviews over and over and over and over. And it really helped me a lot because he was just an amazing person. When I describe him now, I always say when I was 13, I was, reading Rhine, but I was also reading Brad Steiger and Ruth Montgomery and all these people who did little paperback things on parapsychology, and you went to the pharmacy to get it off of a circular tray. And when he was 13, I'm not sure what he started reading to begin with, but he got very interested in parapsychology and psychical research, especially at a very deep level. And by the time he was 14, every time he got money for a job for his mom or, for his birthday, he would send a list of the books that he wanted to my Weiser in New York City, which was a well-known occult bookstore. And he had 2 or 3 of those in London and in France. And as he felt like, he was interesting. He felt like he could learn any language he wanted as long as it was in the romantic kind of group. And all he needed was a dictionary. So he had one out in France, and he had one out in Italy, and then of course in Spain too, because he was born in Boston but raised in Puerto Rico and spoke Spanish as his original. And he was reading William Barrett and all those kinds of people in the SPR. He got his SPR membership about 15 years before I got mine. And his best friend on Puerto Rico, Alfonso Martinez Taboas, who is a psychologist in Puerto Rico, he was also interested in the same thing. They both wrote Eleanor O'Keefe, the secretary at the SPR, when they were 15 years old. So that would have been early 60s, mid 60s, something like that. And she wrote back and gave the 2 of them the addresses. And the 2 of them thought they were going out to have coffee with some old guy with, whiskers everywhere. And but they were going to do it for parapsychology. So off they go, and they discover that they were a year apart. Alfonso was a year older than Carlos, and they were teenagers together. They started a journal when they were junior and senior year of college, and they actually ran it for 4 issues and 2 volumes. And they had a little bit of the saucers and all that stuff. They had a little bit of that too, because there was a lot of those kinds of experiences being talked about in Puerto Rico. So I was basically in La La Land, except for the Rhine books, but he was like right at the core of the information of the field, and buying books from all over the world. And he ended up being able to understand spoken and written Portuguese, Italian, and French, which he taught himself. And then he had English at school, and Spanish was his original. So he was pretty academic. And I always tell people, he's sitting there saying, I'd like to have William Barrett's, blah, blah, Oliver Lodge, all these guys from the 19th century. And I've got my Barbie doll on one side because I don't want to let go of being a child and still reading, Rhine. So it was an unusual thing. When we first worked together, we did a thing for the high school student workshops or high school teacher workshops in Virginia. And I did all the Rhinian stuff, and he did all the spontaneous experiences that we had in our field. So eventually we kind of merged.
You've made an interesting demarcation between spontaneous case studies versus experimental research. And that's, I suppose, the distinction between Rhinian parapsychology and the earlier work that was done largely through the Society for Psychical Research in England.
Exactly. And when I was in college in the 70s, and he was in college, that was it was like a chasm, all of these experiences that people had and all these ideas they had about consciousness and so on that came from psychical research. That was like the background or the groundwork for the experimental stuff. And there was a real chasm there, especially when I got to the Rhine in 82, it was kind of like, no, spontaneous. That's what Dr. Stevens set up in UVA does. He does reincarnation. That's even more. Oh, my God. And for a lot of our generation, and I don't know if you were this way, I think you were, because my group in Chicago bought your dissertation from the University of Michigan once you got your PhD, because we were so excited there was somebody who was dealing with healing and all that stuff. But a lot of us would talk about that at the the Parapsychological Association conferences or in local conferences, about how you cannot have the experiment if you don't have the experiences. And the experiences are rich, and they show the variation of individuals and culture and all these kinds of things. And they connect so much more easily to understanding consciousness and what we really are and all that kind of thing. It opens the door to books that you would never have read before because it started with a cult in it, But the Rhinean way of doing things was, let's try to be, the behaviorist B.F. Skinner from psychology, and just do card guessing and that kind of thing. And I think even all of us who were the younger people at the Rhine, like Richard Broughton and Debbie Weiner and all these people, we were open to the notion that this had to be part of it, that it had to be like this. We couldn't put spontaneous experiences away. That's not just the bedrock; it's the whole context, right? So that was kind of neat. And now I love it that I feel like people understand that this is a much broader way of looking at ourselves and our history and all of that than it was in the late 60s and the early 70s, and the 50s as well for the Rhineans.
Earlier, you referred to the book ESP After 60 Years, published in 1940. And I know the course that you're planning to teach at the California Institute for Human Science pretty much culminates with that book. And in a way, it was a landmark. And let's talk about it. Why is this book, published in 1940, so important?
In the 30s, 40s, and the early 50s, Rhine was very interested in engaging with the skeptics. James Alcock, as much as I don't like some of the conclusions he got to, this is a 1980s skeptical guy. He knew his stuff. He had read everything. He figured everything out, and then he had an opinion. And those people are very, very, very important for the field. You need to have somebody who is going to tell you no. So one of the things that was so unusual about ESP 60 is that there were chapters by these mindful skeptics in that book, as well as with the chapters that were done by the Rhinean group, Gaither Pratt and all those folks. And they had come up with a number of statistical ways to handle some of the data too, which really moved its way out into psychology sort of quietly. And there were two psychologists that were there, Greenwood and Greville. They had a couple of other people, and then Rhine was sort of supervising. Then there was there was a whole section of tables and how to do the statistical stuff. So it was very much pointed towards serious researchers who were just starting out, and for graduate students who were also doing work on this stuff. So that was very unusual as well. It was kind of a justification of the field and a graduate level textbook. And that was unusual. And then the next thing that happened was Henry Holtzfeld. He was the first publisher, and he decided that Gaither Pratt, who actually was the primary writer, he wasn't famous enough to sell that book. So the publisher changed the names. They put Rhine front, and then Pratt, and then everybody else, and out it went. And for years and years, everybody talked about it being, the Rhine et al. Amazing book from 1940 that's going to get us out there where every university has a unit of parapsychology, and we'll be right up there with psychology and all that kind of stuff. Because it was really written that way. It was a really good book. But Carlos and I can't remember who the other person was, but Carlos made the point of writing a little note somewhere about, excuse me, it was Gaither Pratt who was in charge of the writing and getting the people in and doing the structure and so on. Rhine was definitely coming along there because he had goals for that book, but he wasn't the day-to-day guy. He did a lot of fundraising and he wasn't there all the time, and Gaither was always right there. And later on, there was a social kind of blow up where Gaither left and went to Stevenson. And there were some more critical kind of things going back and forth. So there were some nice gossip that came along with the book, but the book was also really unusual and very well done and could be used as a graduate level textbook as well as for some professor who suddenly decided, I want to check this out.
What impressed me about that book is that Gaither Pratt and his colleagues very carefully collected every single critical comment that had been made about parapsychology research going back to the earliest experimental studies, even before Rhine's work at Duke University, and they responded to each and every criticism, basically saying, we have a phenomenon that has withstood all of the criticisms. And I think actually they were correct. As of 1940, parapsychology had made a convincing scientific argument for the existence of what we call psi.
Yes. And some of the people that they had writing chapters were, we heard, not, I haven't gone into the archives to find out if this is really true, but when I started working there in 82, the conversation was, those guys were saying, I just can't get with you guys, but, there's nothing wrong with anything you're doing. I just can't walk over. It was sort of like Isaac Asimov, the science fiction guy. It was kind of like, I know, you got all the evidence. I can't do it. I just can't believe in any of this stuff, So it was kind of, it was definitely a very important sort of watershed for the field. And then it was a cautionary tale for the parapsychologists as well. And we're still fighting that, as you know from the chats and stuff, where you've got to a point where even a quarter of that evidence in another discipline would be accepted. And instead it is still being push back. There must be something wrong, and that's difficult. But I think if you're really interested in it and you're really thinking that, like Carlos and I would have these conversations about belief and evidence, and there were things that I could fall off into belief, and other things that I just had to go hide under evidence. I mean, I can give you an example. I had never had a waking apparition that I knew of. I mean, I had things when I was child, but I was sort of half asleep, so I never really counted those things. But when I moved into my apartment here a year or so after Carlos passed, I was sitting at his desk and I was writing, and I was completely overcome with presence. And I got up and walked out to the living room, and it was nighttime, and the shades on the balcony were open, and I saw him. I saw him in the corner, as physical looking as he ever did when he was young, and he looked like he was young also. And he was looking off my balcony to the place that I always would sit and look, because it was a beautiful kind of semi-urban but semi-rural, kind of a view. And he was smiling, and there he was. So what do? I close my eyes, first I'm just thrilled. And then I close my eyes. And then I open my eyes again to see if he's still there, and he's still there. And I closed my eyes again, and I tried it again. And then I thought, no, this is a thing that a widow would do, that you would have this need for this person. And so you just project that out. I'm going to walk down that hallway and then come back. If he's still there, I'm going to believe. So I go down the hallway and I come back, and I could feel the presence fading as I was coming back to the living room, and he wasn't there. So I could not allow myself to dismiss that. And there are days when I feel like, yeah, I believe in afterlife. I think that was him. And then there's other days when I'm being a psychologist and I'm thinking, well, I was missing him and all this stuff. I was sitting at his desk, So I still do those kinds of things. But it's one of those things that we all have to live with. If we're interested in this and we understand that this is actually very, very important for the understanding of consciousness and life, you just keep going on.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the subject of apparitions, because that was one of the main concerns of the early 19th century psychical researchers.
The census of hallucinations that the SPI, the Society for Psychical Research in London, did was to get an enormous number of people who were interested in the topic to go out and find people, or to provide their own interview of themselves in correspondence and send all that in. And when they finished, they had thousands of these kinds of
first-hand reports.
That's what I'm looking for. First-hand. Nothing was second-hand. And then they went through it. And when you think about that, I have this picture of Edmund Gurney at his desk with all these little piles of index cards, because it's been described that way. And he had little pieces of red tape that he would put around these little things, and each one was a category or a type or whatever. Eleanor and Sidgwick did a lot of the writing of the final report and a lot of her statistical stuff. She and her sister were both very, very good mathematicians. They went through everything they could think of in terms of trying to set up a type. What happens when? What are people seeing? How are they related to each other? It's enormous. It's over 400 pages, I think, that was in the proceedings. It's an incredibly good observational thing, and it included 17,000 people bringing them in. They went through so much stuff, and it was really, really, really heavy duty, like ESP 60, right? It was the spontaneous experience version of ESP 60. It was just humongously evidential. And for all of us, yes. And for Vachid and other people that were he was a French psychologist who were interested in hallucinations, it was like, these people are just, it happened. It's a hallucination. Maybe there's something wrong with them, and maybe it's just that we all have one of those once in a while, and if you really read through that thing, for even a person with sitting on the fence, it's hard to walk away from that without saying, wait a minute, this is another well of incredible evidence for afterlife and for survival and how that works and when it works, that kind of thing. I got actually kind of annoyed with Lloyd Auerbach, who is a well-known paranormal guy in our field, because one day we were having a Zoom and just chatting around stuff, and I said, well, I haven't seen Carlos since a couple of years ago, and he said, well, it's 3 years since he passed, so it's probably not going to happen. I was like, please don't tell me that. I want to see him again. But that census of hallucinations is so amazing. And one of the things that I we used to talk about, and that he was thinking about before we met, was how the original people who started the Society for Psychical Research had quite a lot of women involved. And they may not have been the president or whatever, but they were doing heavy-duty, substantive work for building that pile of evidence, but also analyzing them in a very, very thorough way. And that went all the way up. There's still a lot of really smart folks over there that are women, and so he got very interested in women and in parapsychology and psychical research at all levels, from being researchers, staffers, mediums, psychics, whatever. He got really interested in that, and then in the early 80s, 2 books came out from a woman named Margaret Rossiter, and it was called Women in Science. And it was one of the first books to try and fill those gaps and put the women that were in those laboratories in mainstream science and allow other people to know who the heck they were and what they were doing and what were their challenges and so on. And I have two folders over here in a pile of paper, because he went after that 4 or 5 times before he met me, and then once we got together, he was making these lists, because the idea was that we were going to do a Margaret Rossiter type book of women in parapsychology and psychical research, and not just Anglo-American and English-speaking people, but people from all over the world in all kinds of cultures and countries, because that was another very important thing for him.
Well, for example, one of the most famous women scientists in history, Marie Curie, who won, if I recall correctly, 2 Nobel Prizes, also attended seances.
Yes, she did. And with her husband as well, before he passed away, and then later looking for him. And her daughter also, who wrote her biography, was a brilliant scientist as well. The sad thing is that when you go to see her office in France, it's got this huge thing around it, because absolutely everything is radioactive from her research. You could kill yourself sitting in her chair if you got through the barriers. But yeah, absolutely. There were so many people that were so well known, like Charles Richet and Cesare Lombroso and William James and the Curie. So many people were very, very interested in these kinds of things, and they were willing to decide that they were going to make a decision right away. If they were right on the fence like me, they were just willing to say, no, this is important, so I'm going to keep my ears open. It's like Frank Podmore was really a skeptical guy, but he was always had his mind was always open. And Dingwall was the same way. Eric Dingwall from that same group of people. And then we have Alice James back home in Boston saying to William, "Get away from those people." So there was always somebody that had a different view, right?
You're referring to Alice James, the sister, I think.
The sister, absolutely.
His wife was also an Alice.
Oh, right. I forgot that. Yes, that's right. No, Alice, the sister. And I every once in a while, it happened the first time when I read her her diary. And I was feeling really sorry for Frederick Myers and some of the other people that were friends of Williams, and she didn't like them. And then I thought, well, listen, girl, you had 2 brothers because Henry wrote a lot of wonderful fiction that had paranormal areas in it. I thought, well, you were mad, but there were 2 of them.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Lombroso, Cesare Lombroso, the Italian person. The reason I mention him of all people, he's not that well known to most Americans. However, I happen to have a master's degree in criminology. And so I know Lombroso is considered the father of the discipline of modern criminology. He also wrote about life after death. But the interesting thing to me about the early 19th century or middle 19th century researchers is that they use the methods of criminology to do their research. Their idea was, we're going to if we do a case study, we want to make it as convincing as possible, as if we were presenting the evidence in a courtroom. So they would interview all the witnesses and get testimonials from secondary sources to back up the firsthand reports you talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. One of my first parapsychology type papers that I wrote when we were doing history at Duke was about Cesare Lombroso, and I ended up giving a version of it in the Women in Parapsychology Foundation conference in 1991 in Dublin. And that was interesting because she was really a wild woman. She had a very unusual Eusapia Palladino, the main woman that she worked with. She had a very difficult childhood. She was not a very civilized person. She was very much knew what she wanted to do and what she was going to do, and she was kind of good looking. And if you took care of making sure she couldn't cheat, she could still produce some of these physical mediumship kinds of things. And Cesare Lombroso was very interested in what she was doing, and his group of people around him, like Morselli and so on. But she loved that guy. She called him Papa Lombroso. If he told her to do something, she did it. The person that told me about Cesare Lombroso being a criminologist was actually DJ West, who was a British criminologist, very famous, who was also a member of the Society for Psychical Research. So I was like really amazed, but it's that kind of methodology for a lot of our types of experiences. That's really the right way to go, to kind of make sure you're getting all the information and you're talking to everybody. And, there's this contextual thing. I think it's very important.
I think the early case studies done by the members of the society followed very rigorous procedures.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah, because I think that, I don't know if you remember the argument, very friendly argument between Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, who did everything the SPR way. It was very, 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 his work in past life memories of small children. He used that very Society of Psychical Research methodology. So very detailed, very, every little thing had to be corroborated and checked in and all this. And Louisa and Rhine, because of J.B. Rhine's opinion about experimental, spontaneous experiences. Okay, so now we've left that and we're doing real stuff.
J.B. Rhine had an attitude about case studies.
Yes, that they were the thing that we stood on and did not pick up again, and we just did our card guessing. And so she was not really encouraged to get into correspondence with the people who wrote the letters. They put out a lot of when she came back in her 50s to work in the lab, they put out a lot of calls for experiences and so on. But there might only be one or two rounds of conversation in correspondence. And she and Stevenson would go back and forth all the time about what was the best way to handle these kinds of things. And she would always stay on that side of, well, we're just kind of looking for a hypothesis generating type of evidence. We're not looking for real evidence because it's experience. It's not experimental. And I'm not sure. When I got there, she was still alive. I think I knew her in her last 4 or 5 months, and she was as sharp as a tack, and she had something to say at every research meeting. But she wasn't. I expected her to be very dismissive of what was going on up in Charlottesville, because the Rhine Center was in Durham, North Carolina, so it's like 3 hours in between the debaters. I don't think she was as negative, personally, than as he was. I think she would have liked to have done more with that series. And I know she was very happy when people came from other countries, like Sibyl Schouten from the Netherlands, and other people who would come to take a look at her collection. I think she felt really good about that, that other people with other perspectives and other methodologies were coming and checking that out. And I don't think she would have felt that way if she agreed completely with her husband. And Carlos actually broke the barrier, because the summer study program was going on from the 1970s forward. And nobody had asked anybody up there to come down and talk about out-of-body experiences and reincarnation and all that woo-woo stuff. And in 1983, the younger folks, at the time, Richard Broughton and Debbie Weiner and some other folks, they said, get Alvarado to come down here and tell us what's going on with the reincarnation research, and what's going on with the out-of-body research, and whatever else you would like to talk about. So he came down and he did those two, and then he did two lectures on spontaneous experiences. And from that point on, he was, always a faculty member at the summer study program that we had from then on.
This would be the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man, the organization that J.B. Rhine created when he left Duke University, I think in around 1964 or so.
63 or 64, something like that. Yep. And we were right across from East Campus of Duke. You could walk in like 5 minutes and hit the building that they had the laboratory in. It was a lovely old building, and it was very well set up. We had good computers and that kind of stuff. And it was a really good bunch. It was Jim Carpenter and Richard Broughton. Dr. Rao was running it, and we always had in the summertime, we would have Ed Kelly, who would come in and do a week, and we always had people who would come in and be our 1 week specialist. And we had Chuck Gonerton came down, and William Broad from San Antonio, and all these different people who were well known. And Carlos kind of broke that barrier where it was only experimental, and it became very different. Like Ed May came in to talk physics, and all this kind of stuff was happening. So it was an 8-week program, and it was really a good education. Dr. Rao was always bringing in some of his doctoral students from Andhra Pradesh, so we had a lot of people coming from different places, and the Dalai Lama actually asked to come and see us when he was in Durham back in the day, and so it was just it was a great place to be, because you kind of people knew of the place because of Rhine, but we were all kind of different from. I think Rhine would have thrown most of us out because we had definitely moved on, in terms of how we thought parapsychology should work.
Well, I guess it's fair to say that Rhine put parapsychology on the map. He made the word parapsychology and the word extrasensory perception, or ESP, and psychokinesis part of our daily conversation today. And at a time when it seemed as if the study of mediumship had gone about as far as it was going to go at that point. He launched a whole new wave of interest with his card guessing and dice throwing experiments. But at the same time, he was sort of locked into a certain mentality. So other people began, his students wanted to branch out and do other things, and he began resisting.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. But he did launch so many people like Bob Morris, who was the first Kursler professor at University of Edinburgh, Rex Stanford, Charlie Tart in a way. Yeah, I mean, lots of people were launched by him. And Chuck himself. I mean, there was a guy in the 1940s. His name was Charlie Stewart, and he died when he was 40 because of his heart. And a lot of the older folks would always tell us, if Charlie had lived, because Rhine really liked Charlie a lot, and if Charlie had lived, we would have had free response experimentation earlier than we did, using having people going out like remote viewing kind of thing, or people doing drawing or following up from Warcollier, that French guy from the 19th century who was doing those types of ESP tests where you had to figure out what the picture was that somebody else was trying to send to you. And Gansfeld, which is still going along, where you're put into a kind of a altered state of consciousness, and you're trying to get pictures that are being sent to you or something else. He basically he had a fight with all those guys, Chuck especially, that he wasn't going to do that. But then you would hear out of some of the older guys like Dr. I think Dr. Rao even said it once, but definitely Dorothy Pope, who was the editor of the journal. They were saying, if Charlie had just lived, we would have been able to do all of those kinds of stuff in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and that would have gotten off the ground instead of having to wait for, the late 70s, early 80s, 90s, whatever. I don't think I would have lasted a minute.
You don't think you would have lasted a minute working with Rhine?
I hope I have mellowed in my old age. But when I was young, I was definitely a spitfire. And if somebody didn't like if I didn't like what somebody was doing, I would tell them to their face because I knew, and then like 15 minutes later think, oh my God, maybe they shouldn't have, So yeah, I think he would have bounced me pretty quickly.
The pressure that Rhine was under, he was under constant attack. I understand he even sought psychiatric help at one point to deal with the stress he was under, because the critics, going back certainly to the 19th century, they weren't just intellectual critics. They were out and out hostile, and today they still are.
Yes. Yes.
This is one of the features of the field that doesn't matter how good your evidence is, there are going to be people who are angry that you have this evidence.
Yeah, exactly. When we were, and that makes such a chasm between the two parts, right? That you can't really have a constructive. It's a miracle if there's a constructive conversation between a skeptic and a proponent. And when Carlos and I were working for the Parapsychology Foundation in Manhattan, a young woman came in from, I think it was Geneseo, one of the New York State universities, and she was a sociologist, and she was working on networks and how networks kind of solidified to the point that over time it gets to be not such a good thing. And she was using skeptics from the 70s up to the early 2000s and parapsychologists, and had interviews. I don't think I have a copy of her dissertation, and I should look for it. She was saying at the time that she was interviewing both people on both sides, and there were people on the parapsychological side who were very skeptical about some of the parts of the field. And then on the skeptical side, there were people that were, this thing I think is really really true, this part. But I can't say that around the people that I know. I'll get kicked out of all of my associations and nobody will talk to me anymore. And that was going on both sides. And she used that as evidence for the impact of social networks, that once you get into one, you don't want to lose those people. And when you lose those people and go somewhere else, then you're going to get more criticism and more anger than even the other folks that you've now joined have seen. So it's very difficult. I mean, it was funny because when Jessica Utz first came in, I think this is true. Please, I hope I remember this right. I think she said, either she said that, I have in my head that she said, you guys are a lot nicer than they are in the Mathematics Association. And I was like, we're always getting yelled at him. I mean, people were generally very nice, especially if there was, because I don't think people understand that inside of every single discipline, there's always every single opinion, right? So there are people that we talk to and so on. But I didn't think that we were that good. But apparently there are other scientists who are a little hotter in the head when they start talking than we do.
Well, the interesting thing to me, if we go back to the 19th century, you had some of the most prominent scientists of their era. For example, Sir Oliver Lodge is credited along with Marconi of inventing the radio. And many other things. He was a very strong proponent of survival after death and president of the SPR and a great scientist, probably the foremost scientist of his age in England. But when he came out in favor of the paranormal, it didn't seem to matter. The criticisms were just as outrageous, just as hostile towards his careful work and his writing. You could say the same thing about Sir William Crookes, who discovered the element of thallium, a great scientist as well, president of the Royal Society for Science, and still his work was discounted. I suppose it's because, in particular, the 19th century was a very materialistic age, and the survival of all the phenomena in psychical research and parapsychology is the hardest to explain from a materialistic perspective.
Yeah, it's still difficult, and it's very difficult to find evidence and do things like that. Carlos did an article about the international congresses that they were having from the middle 1890s to, I don't know how long they went, but he was looking at them from the middle of the 1890s to about 1910, 1920, somewhere in there. And at the beginning, the SPR people, Henry and Eleanor Sidgwick and Myers and so on, they were going to these conferences and making speeches, and people were not throwing them out. But then slowly they became too many of them. It was like, okay, if there were 2 or 3 of them talking about their stuff, and that's really interesting for some people. But then as they got along, they started to think that this is a liability, and they literally got kicked out of the congresses, which is sad but typical. And I think what goes on is you're worried about your own even if you're an eminence, you're worried about your own reputation. You're worried about how people are going to see your primary work if you get interested in this stuff. And this one of the last biographies of William James that I read, and I've forgotten the name of I think I forgot his name on purpose, because by the end of it, I was really annoyed with him. He spent like 3 chapters at the end trying to show you that there was no such thing as William James being positive about psychical research. He had a bad habit of having these friends, but, he never did that. So it's like even now they feel like they have to take those guys and they have to wash them of all the taint of pseudoscience. And I always like to say, well, but we're in the Association for the Advancement of Science for a reason, because they couldn't find anything wrong with our methodologies, so they couldn't kick us, And I think slowly things get a little bit better. And I think every generation does what we did when we were younger. This is going to be the generation where we get integrated. And people are going to understand, oh, transpersonal, it's going to help us. Oh, humanistic, it's going to help us. Oh, et cetera. And at some point, there's still a big barrier. But I really feel like if we don't blow ourselves up, I really feel like we are headed for this kind of merging of understanding, especially with consciousness being the glue, right? So every time I hear Marjorie Wolcott talk, I just feel like we're going somewhere. We're going somewhere. It's going to be okay, but it takes a while.
Well, you mentioned the fact that the Parapsychological Association is officially affiliated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. This occurred in 1968, if I remember correctly, and it happened because of a formal vote taken by the Board of Trustees or whoever of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. And as I recall, it was the great anthropologist Margaret Mead who pushed for the acceptance of parapsychology and overcame the objections of other scientists who said this must never happen.
Yes, exactly. Marcello Truzzi was a sociologist of science and knowledge at, I've forgotten now.
Eastern Michigan University, I think.
Yeah, in Ypsilanti. And he was talking about how important it was to be able to talk about the methodology. If the methodology hadn't been what it was, which again is a contribution of Rhine. Although, Charles Roche did the first experiment and so on, this was happening everywhere, but he was the most known, that the methodology was good. And even if the things that we were trying to test were a little unusual, if not very unusual, we were going at it in the right way. And by being able to make that argument, what made all the difference. And what was interesting is that, anthropology was sort of like us at that time. These authors, they go and they get all these funny things that they eat in the mountains of Mexico. You can't trust them. But she made a solid argument intellectually, and they said, okay, it's not, we can't be pseudoscience. We can be a proto-science with good methodology and not getting there where we need to be, not with a theory that we want to have or something that's going to convince other people. But we did have the method down, and we were improving it all the time. And there were more, in some of the journals, there were more disconfirmatory articles than there were confirmatory. So that showed that we were not hiding negative results, that we were actually taking those things in stride and trying to figure out, okay, what does this do to the way that we're thinking about things or testing things and so on. So God bless her.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, Nan. I'd like to go back to your interest in women in science, and in particular, women in parapsychology. You referred a few times to Eleanor Sidgwick, who was a very important early founder of the Society for Psychical Research. And as I recall, later on, she became the president of a women's college.
She was a vice president and a treasurer of Newnham College, which was the women's college at Cambridge, and there was Girton, which was at Oxford. If I'm not wrong, and I might be, she actually met Henry, because Henry and Myers and some of those guys, they were among the men at Cambridge who were working towards bringing women in, and didn't think it was what the heck are you doing? This door should be open to the women that have the ability to be here. That attitude seemed to be in that first group of, the engine room of the Society for Psychical Research, where there were a lot of very smart women that came through there. And Eleanor herself, their family, her father and mother, made sure they were very wealthy Scottish folks, and they made sure that their daughters had the same kind of money passed on to them and same kind of education at home as the brothers. And the brothers were Arthur Balfour, who was a prime minister of the UK, of England, in the early 1900s. So they were a very unusual family. And they really felt like they needed to do this. And for her parents to be in that point of view must have been very difficult for them socially, and the two Sidgwick girls were not into parties and big, beautiful gowns. They wanted to know stuff. And so her family that's what they did. They made sure that the boys and the girls were educated the same. So I think that's how he met her. And then when they finally got in there, very few of the professors would actually teach women, and very few of the professors would allow women into their classrooms. And when people talked about Henry, they would say not only was brilliant beyond belief, but he had this laugh that was like a melody, and everybody was always trying to make him laugh because he had this amazing laugh. So there's this picture, and you have three ladies like this with their little pads, and they're writing on their little pads, sitting together in an empty classroom. And Sidgwick is pushed back on his chair with one foot on the desk and the other foot kind of, off the desk, like the knees on the drawer. And his beard is going to the sky, and he's gesturing and evidently lecturing. And the women just adored this guy, but he was one of the few people who would do it. He also refused to, he was never a full professor there because he refused to sign on the dot for the Episcopalian dogma thing that they had to do at that time. They had to say that they agreed with all of these things for the Church of England. And he was like, nope. So it always stuck him in a position where he could never go farther, but he was also a very wealthy guy, and he didn't care. He loved what he was doing. So he wasn't as stuck to the social milieu like other people were, that he was afraid about anything. He just was more than happy to help these folks out. And it was my favorite picture for years and years, to just open that up and see this guy and these girls going, oh my God. I have to learn this now. But there's actually a really excellent article about Eleanor Sidgwick's impact on women biologists, because she was very interested in that as well. And as such an important person in Newnham College, she would have these girls all together and find them jobs and that kind of stuff.
It does seem to me to be the case that the field of parapsychology, because it's on the fringes of culture, has in many ways associated itself with other movements that are on the fringes. For example, the feminist movement. The spiritualists of the 19th century were often identified as feminists as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and behaved that way as well. But all of these guys that came in as the engineer, the engine room for the Society for Psychical Research, that's what Alan Gauld always called it, they were in some of these other societies that were trying to change the way that the world worked, and that how workers were being treated and how poverty is being treated and so on. So yeah, I think when you're on that edge, it's totally okay to kind of step a little bit lateral, on one side or the other, or back again to something else that's also on that edge. I think that's kind of a wonderful thing. But they were definitely definitely open to the notion of women being as intellectual as the men and able to do really good work. And that had to be such a miracle at that time.
Well, Nan, I know we've just scratched the surface. The history of parapsychology and psychical research is so rich. Most people have no idea. We're talking about probably well over 1,000 research studies have already been conducted, not to mention hundreds of books and journals and proceedings involving some of the greatest intellectual thinkers of the last 150 years. So I'm delighted that we're able to give the New Thinking Aloud audience a little taste of that. And I hope it encourages people to dig deeper.
I hope so too. And don't be afraid, because if it's history, you can go back and look at some books that are pretty old and find absolute gold, like Brian Inglis's books about the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And it's just astonishing. It's really wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Well, Nancy Zingrone, thank you so much for being with me. I also want to remind our viewers that you will be teaching a course on the history of parapsychology and psychical research at the California Institute for Human Science.
Thank you very much, and I'm so excited about that. I've been working on my lectures and how I'm pulling the course bibliography together. I've been trying to recruit people around me that are interested in the women in their countries, so that we can actually have something that's very international. Because that was always so important to Carlos as well, and I think it's the best way to go, is to hear these perspectives across the languages.
Well, thank you so much for being with me today, Nan.
Well, I'm happy about it. I didn't think I was going to have anything to say.
Not only are you a wealth of knowledge, but you also have a very bubbling personality. It comes through and it makes the history come alive.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff. It was really a lot of fun and great to see you again and have so much time with you.
Likewise. And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.
Book 3 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.